All right, a very good afternoon to everyone. Apologies for the delay. There were some technical glitches, so now we will get going. So a very warm welcome to all of you. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we will be talking about the topic of supplier engagement and internal carbon pricing to help value chain decarbonization. And this is my second year at the National Climate Governance Summit. Last year, I spoke on the topics of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 footprinting. So we will be building on to the concepts of those scopes and how we can decarbonize the value chain, which is specifically coming from your supply chain as well. So let's get going. The agenda for today is a brief introduction to Carbon Trust in case some of you still don't know who we are. Then we'll be deep diving into value chain decarbonization and the topic of internal carbon pricing and how it can drive the decarbonization of the supply chain as well as your value chain as well. So very brief introduction to Carbon Trust. We are a mission-driven consultancy organization. And when I say mission-driven, that's because we don't have any shareholders. And whatever profits that we make is channeled into acceleration of the new technologies, like, for example, green hydrogen, energy efficiencies, and all. And our mission is to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. And we help corporates end-to-end in their decarbonization journey, starting with insight, strategy, action, and impact as well. So I won't go into a lot of details because this session is not about what Carbon Trust is doing, but we are here to support you on end-to-end journey. We started 20 years back, so since then we have supported more than 3,000 organizations in their climate action, and we are a trusted guide on the journey towards net zero. And we support businesses, we support governments, as well as financial institutes in their climate action. We are a small team of 400 consultants, policy experts, as well as the engineers who are supporting organizations in their decarbonization journey. I believe this slide is quite familiar with all of you. This is how greenhouse gas emissions of organizations are classified. Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, a very quick recap. Scope 1 are the direct emissions of the organization. Scope 2 are the emissions, indirect emissions coming from electricity use, as well as if you are purchasing any cooling or heating. And then comes the Scope 3, which is classified into 15 categories, and it broadly classified into upstream emissions and downstream emissions. And in this session, we will be focusing more on the supply chain emission, which means the emissions coming from Scope 3 Category 1, which is purchased goods and services, and Category 2, which is your capital goods as well. So that's what we will be deep diving into. And why these two categories are so important? Because whenever you're setting a credible decarbonization target, like for example, decarbonization target aligned with Science-Based Target Initiative, it is required for you to set a decarbonization target for your Scope 3, and that will include your Scope 3 Category 1 and Category 2 targets as well. And typically from our experience, for most of the organizations, Scope 3 Category 1 and Scope 3 Category 2 are one of the most material emission categories in Scope 3. But the Scope 3 categories, as you can see over here, is pretty uncertain as well as pretty complex as well to calculate these. That's where the supply chain programs comes to help. And there are two main objectives of the supplier engagement program. One is to improve the accuracy of your Scope 3 footprint. And second is, the most important one, is to drive emission reductions in your supply chain as well. So if I have to give you an analogy of all the Spider-Man fans here, if his spectacles are the supplier engagement program, and if he's currently not using all those supplier engagement tools, and the small letter gears that you see, those are the suppliers, he can see suppliers are there, but the clarity is not there, where exactly what suppliers are doing, where exactly the emissions are coming from. So if we empower him with the supplier engagement program tools, he will have much more clarity about his supply chain and where the emissions are coming from. And once that clarity is there, the decarbonization together with your suppliers can be implemented as well. So that's what supply chain program can do. So quickly, we'll be going through the two objectives. First one is accuracy of improvement of the scope 3 measurement. So I believe a lot of you here have already started your scope 3 footprint. You might have already done your scope 3 footprint as well. And you might have used spend-based calculation. That's typically where the corporates will start. And as you can see over here, on the x-axis is the time, how scope 3 calculations evolve for corporates over time. It will start with the secondary emission factors, typically spend-based, and gradually over the years, they will start to collect more and more primary data from the suppliers, and then they will have supplier-specific emission factors and supplier-specific emission data as well. And as you can see, with the more specific information, the confidence range of their emissions will improve. There'll be high certainty of the scope 3 emissions that they are reporting and using for designing the decarbonization strategies as well. So that's the first objective of a supplier engagement program. The next objective, and very important objective, is to drive decarbonization. And what we call this slide is just an illustrative example of a decarbonization strategy. As you can see on this slide, on the extreme left-hand side are the baseline year emissions. If you have already set your baseline year emissions, let's say for example 2022, you might have certain baseline year emissions. And then you have a target year as well. Let's say in the near-term target, you have set a science-aligned target to decarbonize by a certain percentage by 2030 or by 2032. So how you are going to achieve that target? The first and the foremost thing is you will have a growth in your organization. So setting a target doesn't mean you have to limit your company's growth. So definitely with growth, you will be purchasing more goods and services from your suppliers, and that will lead to a growth. So this is the first thing that we do with our clients to quantify the growth with their business expansion. And even if the corporates don't do anything, they will still be decarbonizing. And we call it uncontrollable decarbonization. That's coming because of the grid decarbonization, evolvement of the technologies. Technologies will become more efficient in the sector that you are in. So net, you will still have a net increase in your emissions compared to the baseline year. And that's where you need to have proactive interventions in your business so that your decarbonization is aligned to what the science-aligned targets are. So like for example, some of the interventions are product design innovation, how you can innovate your own products and services so that it is using the raw materials which have low embodied carbon or which are using less energy during the use phase as well. Next is supply chain improvement, how you can work with your suppliers to ensure the products and services they are supplying to you have low carbon, as well as the transportation of those are kind of optimized as well, so that upstream emissions associated with the purchase of those goods and services are minimized as well. And then one of the difficult emissions to decarbonize is the downstream emissions, basically where you sell your products and those products are used using grid's electricity, which might not be decarbonizing in line with the climate science. But you can engage your downstream customers and kind of influence them on the decarbonization of the products that you're selling to them. So that's how I have explained to you in a very simple manner, but when we actually deliver the project, it takes months and months to come up with something which is actually applicable to the organizations. So that was the second objective. All right, so this slide is specifically focusing on scope 3. You start with measurement. I mean, there is a saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. So you start with your scope 3 measurement, and it's not a just one-time exercise. You need to continuously measure and improve your scope 3 footprint over the time. Next is set target. As I mentioned, the best way to set target is what the science is saying. So set a scope 3 target, which is aligned to science science-based target initiative. Then is deliver on the reduction strategies as well. So in order to do all these, the supplier engagement programs is helpful. And supplier engagement program consists of three main steps. The very first step is identify who your key suppliers are, which suppliers are contributing most to your emissions in your supply chain. Next is engage your top suppliers, collect specific data from them, and integrate that improved information in your scope 3 footprint. And finally, reduce the emission together with your suppliers as well. And all throughout this, you need to integrate carbon management into the procurement processes as well. So we will be touching upon something called internal carbon pricing that a lot of corporates have started to utilize and integrate that into, when they are evaluating the supply, basically who to award the contracts for their purchase goods and services as well. But there are many other ways, like setting an environmental performance criteria when evaluating a service provider or a goods provider as well. So all those things can be implemented in your procurement processes as well. So let's go through these one by one. The very first one is identification of the purchase materials and components. And so the aim is prioritize the suppliers and then understand what engagement strategy you need to have with them. So typically, I believe most of you are already here. That means you have already done your scope 3 footprint. You already have a supplier list, and you have a procurement data as well to use basically. And where you want to be is, you need to have a prioritized list of suppliers and an engagement strategy as well. So how do you reach from here to here is by using two things. One is materiality assessment and a qualitative assessment as well. So what these are? So materiality assessment is basically you use spend-based data, which most of the organizations will have, your procurement data, your finance data will have. You convert that from sector-specific proxies into the tons of CO2e. But in case a better data is available, definitely that will supersede. And then what you do with that is you chart something called a Pareto chart or a 80-20 kind of principle that you might have heard of, which means 80% of your emissions from your suppliers might be coming from only 20% of the suppliers that you have. So we chart this, as you can see over this, 80% of the emissions are actually coming from supplier A, B, and C. And I mean, one supplier might be supplying you multiple materials and products as well. So you just need to plot it out, and from that you will be able to prioritize which are the suppliers that you need to engage with, those who are most material for your scope 3 category. Then a qualitative analysis need to be done. So some of the questions that you need to ask is, will those suppliers, top suppliers, remain the key suppliers for your organization going forward? Is there going to be material change in the way you are doing the business? And with that, those suppliers might not remain the key suppliers for you. The next question will be, what is the supplier's sustainability maturity? Has your supplier committed to a science-based target? Has your supplier done the product carbon footprint? Have they got it verified from an external consultant? Are they doing CDP disclosure? Have they reported climate risk and opportunity disclosure? What plans do they have to reduce their emissions in future? So all those things need to be considered for your supplier engagement strategy. And what data does your organization has for the supplier organization? Is your supplier transparent enough to give you all those data or not? And finally is, what ability does your organization have to influence the supplier organization? Are you, one of the major clients for your supplier? If you're not, you might not have that influencing power on your supplier and work together with them. And how to do that is, we have this 2x2 matrix basically. On the x-axis is the ability of you to influence your supplier, and on y-axis is the supplier's sustainability maturity. Have they already done PCFs and all those things as well? So based on that, like for example, this is a bubble chart. The size of the bubble represents the amount of emissions from those suppliers, and the color means the quality of emissions from those suppliers. So let's say a supplier is on this quadrant where you have high ability to influence, and the supplier's sustainability maturity is very high as well. That means you can already start to collect the PCF data from them, and you can collaborate on the reductions for the supplier as well, which will help you reduce your scope 3 footprint. On the contrary, if your ability to influence is very low and the supplier's sustainability maturity is very low as well, then you can support your supplier to do the product carbon footprint as well, so that the data is available to you and you can use it for your better scope 3 footprint. Then there are always, PCF. Basically, PCF is the key thing, the product carbon footprint that you need to ask your suppliers to provide to you. And then, if possible, how you can collaborate with them on the reductions as well. So the output of this qualitative assessment will be objective and nature of engagement and the number of suppliers that you will be engaging with. Next is on the collection of the supplier specific data. So the first step is to engage with your selected suppliers from the previous step, and then you collect the supplier specific data as well. But a very important step is assessment. You need to assess the data that you have collected with your supplier and then integrate it into your current scope 3 footprint that you have and upgrade that scope 3 footprint. So what's the typical engagement approach? Oops. So the typical engagement approach will be your procurement managers together with the sustainability team or sustainability managers will reach out to those main suppliers. There'll be a meeting and a written documentation as well. I was recently a part of it just a few days back. And then an important part is providing the context to your suppliers on why those carbon reduction targets are required. Maybe your organization might have committed to a science-based target, to a net zero target as well. So you need to collaborate and cooperate with your suppliers to reach that targets as well. And then you need to gain an understanding of suppliers' level of carbon management maturity, the range of products that they are selling now, what they are planning to sell in future, as well as what are their future targets and what the data availability is from the suppliers as well. So these are some of the engagement with the suppliers, the approaches, and the outcome will be a shared understanding with the supplier on the long-term goal. It's a common goal for you as well as your suppliers that you all need to reach together, and then an initial assessment of suppliers' carbon maturity and the data availability that you have. This slide goes a bit more technical, and this diagram might be familiar with a lot of you. If you have done your scope 3 footprint already, there are different ways of doing scope 3 footprint. And the one at the bottom is the spend-based method, which is typically the easiest and quickly done type of scope 3 measurement. And sometimes clients will also do average data method as well, like a sectorial average data, if they have time and they have collected more specific data. But ideally, what we need is a supplier-specific data. And as you can see, there are two parts to it. One is the supplier's own scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then your supplier's upstream emissions, which are the embodied carbon of the supplier. Your supplier might have their own scope 1 and 2 emissions. Typically, it's expected for them to have the scope 1 and 2 emissions. But embodied carbon emissions or the upfront emissions, they might not have. So sometimes, if the supplier-specific data for both scope 1 and 2 and the upstream emissions are not possible, then we use a method called hybrid approach, where we use supplier scope 1 and 2 primary data, but we use average data for the upstream emissions for them. So ideally, we need a product carbon footprint. As I've been saying repeatedly, the product carbon footprinting is the one that you need to ask your supplier. And if that is not available, you need to do a hybrid approach for calculation. And as you can see, we are asking for current as well as the old PCFs. And I met some of the suppliers, big suppliers, they are doing product carbon footprinting for many years. And over the year, their product carbon footprint changes as well. So it will be a good kind of assessment how good your supplier is doing, what initiative they are putting in to decarbonize their own scope 1, 2, and 3 as well as their product emissions as well. But as I said earlier, assessment is a very important criteria or part of this as well, because as you can see in the last line, supplier specific data is not necessarily a better data. And the reasons are whether the quality of data, what your supplier is providing, is it self-declared or is it actually verified by a third-party auditor or consultant? It should be ideally verified by a third-party consultant. Is it complete? Is it only, let's say, scope 1 and data which is available, and the upstream data are on average data? Then that's a risk on the accuracy of the scope 3 data that they're providing. And finally is the representativeness. Your supplier might have scope 1 and 2, and they might have multiple product lines. So how they're allocating their scope 1 and 2, the specific products line that they have. So is the data that they're providing is representative or not? So that's where probably when we as a consultant come in, we will help our clients do that assessment of the quality, completeness, and the representativeness of that data as well. So moving on, so we have been talking about PCF. So how does a PCF looks like to your supplier? So the chevron that you see over here is a kind of a life cycle emission, cradle to grave emissions, which starts with the raw material production and distribution, product manufacturing, then starts with the distribution and retail, use phase, and finally the disposal as well. And the example given over here is for the ICT sector. They use copper, they produce ICT goods, and then they have like those towers and all which are used, and then finally they are disposed as well. So how this life cycle emission integrates with your supplier's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So what you need to ask your supplier is the cradle to gate emissions. This is what you need for your scope 3 category 1, the cradle to gate emissions. We call it like manufacturer's emissions. And these are the different scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 categories, how that all these are of your suppliers and how this will integrate with the life cycle emissions of your supplier as well. So if your supplier is quite mature, they might have already done this calculation either on their own or through a consultant. If not, you can start to engage them and request for this PCF information from them. So once you have collected the data, you need to start integrate the data into your scope 3 footprint. And that's where the challenges start to come in. So let's say in the first year, you might have done most of your scope 3 footprinting based on spend-based emission factors, spend data and spend emission factor. And this year, you might have already engaged your suppliers and you have a primary data, or let's say number of tons, and you have a supplier-specific emission factor as well. And with that, your data might have improved. But the improved data and the reduced emission doesn't necessarily mean you have reduced your emissions. It might be a false kind of reduction that you might be seeing. I'll try to explain how. So if we look at, let's say 2022 was the baseline year, the original year, and the scope 3 emissions were, let's say, 100 tons. But in year 2023, you managed to get more accurate data from your suppliers, and then you saw this reduction. But this might not be the actual reductions, because improvement in the data doesn't mean you have actually reduced your emission. So what needs to be done is something called a rebaselining. So we have to go back to the baseline year and account for that, the data, the spend data, if it was replaced with the primary data, what the baseline emissions will be. So this is a key thing, and lots of corporates are, they calculated their scope 3 emission 2-3 years back. Now they have better data, and sometimes they claim, oh, we have reduced, we are in line with the science-based target trajectory without considering the rebaselining. So it becomes pretty important for organizations to consider rebaselining if required. So there is a rebaselining policies and everything. Typically the threshold is 5%. If there is 5% more than 5% improvement, then you need to do a rebaselining as well. There are a lot more details about the rebaselining. It can be because of emission factor, it can be because of more granular primary data availability as well. Next is engagement with your key suppliers. So how you do it is, typically there are 3 steps, but it doesn't need to be followed in the chronological sequence. You can start with engaging your suppliers and start to reduce it as well, and concurrently start to get more primary data from your suppliers as well. And how it will help you is there are so many benefits of doing the value chain footprinting, but the two main benefits of engaging your supplier will be procurement and supply chain collaboration and improvement, also your own R&D of the products, and supply chain innovations as well. So these are few advantages of specifically doing the supplier engagement program. And again, you might have many suppliers. So what will be your supplier engagement strategy, like segmented strategy? This is just an illustration. So on the x-axis is your carbon impact coming from that supplier, and y-axis is your nature of relationship. Is your nature of relationship with that supplier strategic? Are they a key supplier, or is it purely transactional relationship? So if your supplier has a high carbon impact on your footprint and they're strategic to you, you need to have one-to-one engagements with them. But if not, you can have like one-to-many initiative, like some can be low cost and some can be moderately cost initiative as well. Because typically big organizations will have maybe thousands of suppliers. So you really need to prioritize and be focused on your engagement strategies with all your suppliers. And by the way, this is very dynamic. The suppliers currently who might not be your top suppliers, they might become your top suppliers in terms of emissions, because if your top suppliers start to decarbonize, so your tier 2 suppliers will become your top emitting suppliers as well. So this is a very dynamic exercise that need to be reviewed after every few years as well. All right, so just to give you a bit more context, this is a case study from a recently published paper that we have done for Achieving Climate Targets Guide for the ICT sector. And this is specifically for Scope 3 decarbonization of the mobile network operators, how the mobile sector can work together with MNOs, suppliers, customers, industry associations, and the governments as well. So if you have to classify into three main buckets, the first one is circularity and product design for longevity and repair as well. So how the suppliers can have more circularity in their business model rather than a linear business model, which is basically extract, produce, and just goes into the landfill. How we can bring circularity, how we can improve or have a longer lifetime of, let's say, the handphone sets, and how we can have a repair concept as well rather than just disposing the products as well. And all these will help us in decarbonization of the network equipments, services, and the devices. This is more specifically for the ICT sector. Then lifetime extension of the devices, as I just mentioned, and the increased energy efficiency of the devices as well. How efficient, let's say, our mobile phones are when we are using it. So that's the downstream emissions for the company who is selling those mobile phones as well. Then, as I mentioned earlier, to decrease the user's emissions, it's not easy. So you need to have a vocal climate leadership. There need to be engagement in the energy policy. So the big kind of companies, they can have influence on the energy policies to drive transition to low carbon electricity. Basically, how the grid decarbonization can be accelerated. Because without that, it will be very difficult for these companies to decarbonize their use phase emissions or the downstream emissions. And then finally, collaboration is the key, collaborating with the joint ventures to improve the Scope 3 footprint measurements, reporting, science-based targets, and the implementation of emission reduction plans as well. So that was just one case study. There are a lot more details available on the report, but in the interest of time, I'm not sharing a lot of details. So let's go on to the next topic, very interesting topic of internal carbon pricing, which can be used as a tool to help you decarbonize your supply chain emissions as well. So before we deep dive into the concept of internal carbon pricing, let's talk about what a carbon price is actually. So I'm giving you an analogy over here. So how much are you willing to pay for a house with 2 rooms? Let's say some amount. Exactly. So what if the house comes with it's the same 2 room, but with a sea view? You might be planning to pay a bit high. But what if it's the same house, it's a bigger house with 4 room, but next to a power station, you might not be willing to pay the same amount. And that's what we call negative externality. All these are, negative externalities which are reducing the price. And the same concept applies to the carbon pricing as well. So, a word of caution, we are not covering the topic of internal carbon pricing yet, but in general, the carbon pricing. So as you can see over here in this graph, on the x-axis is the quantity of emission, y-axis is the price. So currently in a lot of countries, there is no carbon tax, which we call like external carbon price. So that means the cost to the emitter, let's say someone is still burning diesel, so they just have to pay this amount of price basically, which is based on what is the price of the diesel. But when they burn the diesel emits carbon or GHG emissions, and those GHG emissions are going to have a negative impact on our society. Society have to pay a cost for all these, damage to the property, damage to the crops and everything, and many other damages. So society has to pay a price to all those damages that someone who is emitting those GHG currently. So the carbon pricing, what it does is basically prices those negative externalities to the source, the one who is actually emitting them. So rather than waiting for the damage to be done, they've already started to price that in. So that's the concept of carbon pricing, to link the negative externalities to the source of the carbon emissions. And I'm sure you all have heard of a lot of discussions going on in Malaysia on the external carbon pricing. I mean, me and my team come from Singapore, where we already have a carbon tax implemented for many years. But most likely, I mean, we are not sure, but it might be carbon tax or it might be emission trading scheme, which might be implemented in Malaysia very soon. And these are all part of external carbon pricing, because you're giving it to outsider, maybe a government. So typically it's the carbon tax or emission trading scheme. I think it was covered in the earlier presentations as well, which is basically a cap and trade mechanism. I mean, South Korea is using it, Europe is, EU is using it, China is using it as well, but in Singapore and in Malaysia, it might be the carbon tax or ETS. Then there's offsetting as well. So a lot of times you will see, okay, oh, we are emitting this much, and we will just buy, offsets from the voluntary carbon markets as well. So that is a form of external carbon pricing as well. Not maybe mandatory, but the voluntary one. And then result-based climate finance, again, you are giving those carbon or the price to the third party as well. But what is important as a corporate is the internal carbon price. And what internal carbon price is the value or a price that a company voluntarily sets for themselves to internalize the economic cost of the greenhouse gas emissions. So basically, if the corporates are already anticipating there will be a carbon tax in the country that they are operating in, so rather than waiting for that to come in, they are proactively this is a risk mitigation measure. So they're already started to price in on their decisions of what type of projects to invest in, on the capital expenditures, as well as the suppliers engagement and supplier selections as well. So that's what internal carbon pricing is. So we'll be deep diving a bit into the internal carbon pricing. So why is ICP a useful business tool? It spans across, as you can see, it will help you reduce your future risk, and at the same time it will help you seize the opportunity as well. So in terms of future risk addressing, it will help you stay ahead of the competition. It will help you understand the least cost emission abatement option. It will help you future-proof against the government regulation. And there is a form of carbon price that will help you create funds to develop innovative new products, technologies, and services. I'll soon get into the different approaches for internal carbon pricing. And it can help you enjoy support from your investors as well, which is very important. Because as an organization, you have a lot of investors. Investors want to make sure their investment is secured, and it is all the future risk to their investments are mitigated as well. So that's where internal carbon pricing comes into the picture. You might have seen a lot of corporates publicly announcing what the internal carbon pricing they have set for their businesses as well. This is just to give confidence to the investors that they are already kind of anticipating these regulations and they have already started to consider it in their operations. Few years back, Schroders had this kind of statement. Almost half of the listed global companies would face a rise or fall of more than 20% in earnings if carbon pricing rose to $100 a ton. But now I believe a lot of people say even $100 is not enough. It should be even more than that. The kind of damage that the GHG emissions are doing are much more than $100 a ton. But and some companies have said, I have seen a company setting $200 a ton for their internal carbon pricing as well. And in Singapore, I think currently people are using $50 a ton. Singtel is using $50 a ton for now. Temasek has some recommendations as well. But yeah, that's the current range, and it might go up. As I said, this is a very dynamic field. Internal carbon price actually depends on your business as well specific, which I'll be deep diving into a bit. So internal carbon pricing helps you an active approach. As I said earlier, there will be organizations who will follow the regulations. They'll wait for the regulations to come in. But if you're implementing ICP, you're taking a proactive approach that even before the regulations start to kick in, you are prepared for those regulations. And it helps you in better decision making as well. So there are different ways of business application where ICP can be applied. It can be on your capital expenditures. It can be on your operational decision, on your procurement decisions, that's where the supply chain come in, on your product and R&D decisions, and also the remuneration decisions as well for the departments or for the CEOs and for the senior management as well. So this is again just an illustrative example of comparing how you can apply ICP to a capital expenditure decision. Let's say a company is contemplating between buying a traditional blast furnace versus an electric arc furnace, which will run on renewable energies. That's the assumption over here. So without ICP, I mean, both are same basically in terms of financial matrices. But once you start to apply ICP, you will see that the traditional blast furnace, the IRRs and everything, the financial matrices are not that attractive. It will favor the electric arc furnace. And this is such a key because, I mean, these capital expenditures, these equipments will be there for like 20, 25, 30 years. So it's very important to consider what type of additional cost all these equipment might be exposed to. So we have worked with certain utility companies, the power generation companies, and we help them implement this internal carbon pricing in their decision. Basically, they have decided not to invest anymore in the fossil fuel because the internal carbon pricing for investment in any fossil fuel will be super high. So this is just an example. This can be applied to many other capital expenditures as well. So where should you apply internal carbon pricing? Again, this slide must be very familiar to you, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So Scope 1 are the direct emissions, Scope 2 from your electricity, and then so many emissions in the Scope 3. So let's do a quick, before that, when should you be using your internal carbon pricing? So does your investment have a Scope 1 and 2 impact, as we saw earlier in the example of blast furnace versus electric arc furnace? If it has an impact on your Scope 1 and 2, yes, you need to apply dollar per tons of CO2. And over the next few slides, we will be talking about, what dollar, how can you come up with those dollar values as well for your internal carbon price. But if the investment is within your Scope 3 hotspots, you need to decide whether the emissions are coming from purchase of that good. That means the embodied carbon, or most of the emissions will be from the running of that equipment. Like, let's say, for example, a pump set. A pump might have a very low embodied carbon, but the running cost will be very high. But it will typically run like 24/7, and that's why you need to have, for such type of products, you need to have efficiency data. So the carbon emission data need to be gathered as well for implementing internal carbon price. But if it is more of the embodied carbon, let's say, for example, if it is a furniture which doesn't have any running cost, then you need to have the product footprint data. If you remember earlier, the cradle to gate emission, those data need to be you need to have those data, and then you can apply the internal carbon pricing on that. So let's say this is an emission profile of an organization. Most of their emissions are coming from scope 3 downstream supplied goods, basically the goods that they are selling. The next big emissions are coming from their upstream purchased goods and services, and they have a bit of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions as well. So let's say if we need to apply internal carbon pricing for their purchased goods and services, the one there where they work with their suppliers. So they can use internal carbon pricing to assess suppliers' contract. They can put that implicit price or shadow price to when they are awarding a contract to a supplier, when they're deciding which supplier to actually choose. This will help them reduce their scope 3 emissions. For scope 1 and 2 reduction, as we shared earlier, the example between blast furnace versus electric arc furnace, it will help you evaluate the investment projects on the, basically on the risk on your investment, the climate-related regulatory risk. Even the physical risk can be incorporated into that internal carbon price as well. Then you have your downstream supplied goods, that is the ICP in the operational decisions. So basically, the efficiency measures in processing the goods that you're buying, and how you can apply ICP to the improved logistics in the warehouse as well, which will be in your upstream emissions when we are buying goods. ICP can also be applied in the R&D decisions as well, what type of R&D products that your organization should be developing. And the one which is not covered in this is ICP. ICP can also be used to influence employee behavior. Recently, we were working with a client, they had very high business travel emissions. So how to reduce business travel emissions, especially when their senior management are flying and they are reluctant to reduce the flying. So the way it can be done is by implementing internal carbon pricing. You put a price to that, to the flight emissions, and then you use that money collected to invest in certain procurement of low embodied carbon goods and services, or you can procure renewable energies with that. So that if you're not able to reduce scope 3, your business travel emissions, you're able to reduce emissions in other categories by implementing that internal carbon price. All right, so we were talking about how to put that dollar value to the carbon price, right? So there are different ways to approach the carbon pricing. 4 main ways are shadow price, implicit carbon price, internal trading system, and internal carbon fee. So the first one is your shadow price. Shadow price is a hypothetical surcharge on carbon emissions in line with the predicted future regulation, basically the cost that the regulation carbon taxes might put in. And you can use it in your procurement, in your capex, and in your investment decisions as well. Some of the advantages of this type of approach is it's easy to implement, it anticipates legislation change, and it helps in the risk management as well. But some of the disadvantages are it is hypothetical. So when we work with the clients, we look at all the SSP scenarios, and based on that, we come up with the price that need to be put in the different regions, whether that region already has a carbon price or they're going to implement carbon price pretty soon. So based on all those research, we recommend a shadow price to our clients. And then there is an implicit carbon price, which is basically dependent, calculated retrospectively. So what was done, how much was spent on procuring renewable energy or on your energy efficiency or meeting any regulations, and how much reduction that basically the cost bring it. Based on that, you implement an internal carbon price. We call it like an implicit carbon price as well. The disadvantage is it is calculated retrospectively, so may not drive change, but some of the advantages are it reflects the actual action taken as well as helps understand the existing costs as well. The third one is internal trading system, which is very similar to the cap and trade system, but instead of government applying it on the organizations or a sector, it is applied internally by the organization on their departments. So if a department is able to, if they manage to emit lower than the cap, they can basically have an internal trading within their organizations. It allows the market to find that's the advantage, the most efficient carbon reduction, but it can be very complex to administer. You might need to have a department to actually implement that. So I have not seen a lot of clients implementing this, and there might be risk of oversupply of the credits as well. And the final one is internal carbon fee. This is also quite common, where internal business units are charged based on the carbon fee. As I mentioned earlier, it was the business travel. So internal carbon fee is used on that. And once you have collected that fee, you can invest in the so once you've collected that fee, you can invest in the renewable energy offsets or in the energy efficiency as well. The disadvantages are it imposes additional cost on the business, and these are often set too low. So there is, I mean, if it is too low, it doesn't change the behavior, it doesn't reduce your emission. I think the carbon price is not set correctly. So it needs to be high enough, the carbon price, so that it changes the behavior of the organization. So just a case study for a bank. So for this bank, the emissions were coming from the scope 1 and 2 and travel related emissions as well, excluding the category 15 emissions, the financed emissions. So those were dealt separately. But how they come up with the carbon fee of $60 per ton was basically they had this number of how much, you know, to halve their energy consumption, how much investment will be required based on the past experience that they had. So they came up with an average number of $9 million per year will be required. That means total 90 million will be required over the 10 years. And when they divided it by how much carbon emissions will be there in their scope 1 and 2 and travel related emissions, they come up with this price. Basically, if they start to collect this money, they can use it for energy efficiency measures or procuring green energy, so they will still be able to meet their reduction or carbon reduction targets as well. So this was implemented by one of the banks. So what are the steps for implementing internal carbon price? First is to engage the business. That's a very key step. You need to tell them the rationale, why ICP is being implemented, what are the reasons your organization might have committed to some targets. So it's very important to tell them in the long run, all the employees, departments will be benefited out of this internal carbon pricing. Next is design a best practice approach. We covered the 4 different type of approaches. So you need to find out what is the best approach for your organization and for your business. Once you have identified that, roll out the internal carbon price and then monitor, report, and evaluate it regularly as well. The most important part is being flexible and willing to adjust, because the most important part is to meet the objectives of the business as well. So this need to be updated regularly. Our clients usually come to us every year to help them update their internal carbon pricing model so that it stays relevant to the current business environment and the latest policies as well. So final remarks on internal carbon pricing is it's not written in stone, the internal carbon pricing. It's not something, once you have set it, you just have to stick to it. You can always regularly update it. If you think the internal carbon price set is too low, it is not driving change, or it is not driving decarbonization, you should always update it. One size does not fit all. So the carbon pricing set by one organization might not be suitable for your organization. So there is no one carbon price which is suitable for all. Finally, keep it simple. Avoid overcomplicating it. Typically, when people hear about internal carbon price, they always think it's a very complicated thing. So it is very important for you all as a sustainability department to keep it simple, to convey the message very simply to the departments, all those that will have internal carbon price exposure to them. So thank you very much for that. That was my last slide. And happy to take any questions if you have. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They can totally set a different carbon price. So this is the slide which shows. So like for example, what you're buying from your supplier, you might have to put a different price as compared to the price, let's say what you're putting for your business travel. So ultimately, the objective is it should change the behavior. People should start to fly less, and your procurement department should start to procure more, less carbon intensive. You mean to say these? Also, you have to select one. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it will be a bit complicated. I mean, you can actually theoretically implement different, but just to keep things simple, as I said earlier, right, so that everyone else can understand easily, implement probably one type of, and typically, from my experience, shadow pricing and internal carbon fee and implicit are most popular. Internal trading, a lot of most popular, if I have to say, is the shadow price actually. A lot of organizations use shadow price for the internal carbon pricing. But yeah, it's up to you how you want to. I mean, it will be a bit complicated, but if you think you can implement it, yes, it's absolutely correct, correct. And you can explain it like somewhere, oh, why they are being charged this much, why I'm being charged this much. So if you can explain it, so sometimes it's easier to keep things simple, consistent across. Yep, yep, might be different, yeah. So if your organization is big enough, I'll recommend you can have different type of ICP as well, yeah. Yep. You mean to say like are corporates implementing it? Yes, they are actually. So I can give. So I mean, as the name suggests, it's the internal carbon price, right? So it will help them in the decision making. So in the accounting, let's say, it's kind of liability, but as I said, it's hypothetical. So if let's say, like for example, you are going to a management, you want your investment committee to either invest in traditional blast furnace versus electric arc furnace. So they will do all the financial modeling and everything, right? And they will come up with these numbers basically. But when companies are incorporating internal carbon price, they will have one additional line in their financial model, which will take care of this ICP. So there will be this additional cost item for the carbon price. And that's where the IRR, everything will change. And that's where they will. So it's not a physical kind of money, but that physical money can come in internal carbon free. So that is something you have to account for in your balance sheet that you have. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Correct. It- Correct. Correct. So I mean, this amount will actually be like spent on these. So it will somewhere belong to your books. Yeah. Yep. Correct. 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 I think hopefully more on this side, less on the carbon offset side. Yeah. Correct. 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 So yep. Hmm. Well, all right. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Correct. So, I mean, the carbon tax in Singapore is currently applicable only to scope 1 and 2 emissions of the companies. So, the companies that are impacted are like the power generation companies, the fleet, the taxi fleet companies, and some sectors like semiconductor manufacturing as well. So, no, no, no. It's only within the country boundaries. That's why it's a correct, correct. And there is nothing like a cross-border tax like EU, right? CBAM. Not yet in Singapore, but I don't know, maybe in future they might be doing something similar, like taxing on the import of the carbon intense goods. This is all internal. This is all voluntary. So this is for the organizations to implement themselves. So some of the example, as I said in Singapore, was Singtel. Then globally, Microsoft has said it. There's a Swiss RE. They've said $200, and there are many other organizations who have set this internal carbon pricing to drive this decarbonization as well. So I'm not sure whether any one of you have set an internal carbon price within your organization. None yet. All right, but hopefully you will be setting pretty soon. Don't wait for the regulation or the carbon tax to come in. Just start now. Early bird catches the worm. So start to implement your internal carbon pricing as soon as possible. Yeah. Mm. Yep. Correct. Very good question. Yeah. So, I mean, your question is what if this, I mean, the assumption over here is your scope 3 is already kind of comprehensive and complete. You've done all the 15 categories, whichever is applicable. But if you're saying the emission itself in the baseline year was not complete, then my question will be that might not even be considered your baseline emissions. Because if the emissions fall under your boundary and you have not calculated it, then it's not in line with the GHG protocol actually. So it's like something is missing. So if, so as per the recommendation of GHG protocol, even if something is missing, right, you need to use proxy data to calculate those emissions roughly. So even for the baseline year, the assumption will be you have done your calculations thoroughly, but your calculations might improve, as you said, right? Emission factor might improve over the course of time. Let's say, for example, an example will be, let's say chicken. Your company is buying some chicken there, and you did in 2022, you did that calculation based on amount of RM spent or dollar spent on buying chickens. But after a few years, your chicken supplier managed to give you the data for how much emissions are coming from the chicken. Then you have this data. So what you need to do is, we call something called interpolation actually. We need to look at the data, go back into the baseline year emissions, and then change your baseline year emissions to, it can be reduced, it can be increased as well. So, yep. Mm, correct. Mm, yep, yep, correct. So, I mean, earlier your question was whether this is an organic growth, right? Whether we are talking about the same supplier currently. But if it is a totally new supplier, that means the company's, it's a growth. It's a new emissions, right? It's not something which is, yeah, correct. Oh yeah, definitely the emission factor will change, definitely. So if you look, oops. So I mean, if you remember that cradle to gate emissions, that will change because if the, if your, oops, if your chicken was coming from, let's say like Malaysia to Singapore, now it's coming from Brazil, the upstream transportation of that would have increased by a lot. So you have to, it's less. How come? Uh, maybe the feed or something. But I mean, yeah, I mean, typically what happens is closer you're buying it from, maybe it's the way they are raising the chickens, maybe the way they are feeding, what they're feeding might be very high. So that's where the product carbon footprint comes into the picture. I'll show you that. So basically this one, you see, the raw material production and distribution, if we apply it to chicken, how those, what was fed to them, how they were raised and everything. If this is different, then you need to account for those cradle to gate emission, and which will be different if you're buying from Malaysia versus if you're buying from yep, yep, eco invent is it? Ah, correct, correct. So yeah, yeah, those are the kind of challenges I'll say. The database itself upgrades itself, right, for the emission factors. I mean, it will take quite a lot of years, especially in our region, I'll say. Hopefully in our lifetime, I'll say, maybe in few years, because a lot of companies are setting those targets, and the suppliers are now feeling the pressure, and they have started to calculate these numbers as well. So if you remember earlier, we were talking about current and old, right? That's why we need to collect the old PCF and the new PCFs as well to understand the changes that you have just highlighted, right? So understand whether the PCF is changing year on year as well or not. So getting this data from your suppliers is key. So all of you, please start asking the data from your suppliers so that we can see the change in our lifetime itself. Maybe in the next few years already we'll start to see the change. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Correct. Exactly. Exactly. Thank you very much. Correct. So I mean, just to share why buying chickens from Brazil is less carbon intense is because the way the electricity grid over there is cleaner. Actually, they are using more renewable energy, whereas the electricity grid in Malaysia is not that clean for now. So that's the reason. Uh, I think maybe you can share the on the app actually. Maybe you can share with everyone the link of the report so that everyone can read it. Any other questions from anyone? Yep, absolutely. On internal carbon pricing, no, it's totally voluntary actually. But objective is at some point in time, internal carbon price will be replaced by the voluntary external carbon price actually. So this is mainly internal carbon prices just in the interim, expecting the regulatory change basically. So as you see here, it's a price that companies voluntarily set for themselves basically, just to make that change, drive change quickly. Yep, exactly. Correct. So rather than like start paying tax 5 years from now, they will say no. I'll just. And sometimes a lot of companies will say no. What governments are implementing, the tax rate is a bit too low. In reality, the damage done by their GHG emissions is more. So they might set a carbon price which is higher than what the government is implementing. It really depends on the organizations how how ambitious. Yep, correct. And that carbon price has a trajectory as well. So like exactly, exactly. And a lot of people are saying what Singapore said is not is less. It should be higher than that. Yeah. All right. Any other questions from anyone? Yeah. If not, then thank you very much, everyone. Yeah.